At 4:17 in the afternoon on Sunday, May 30th, 1948, a section of railroad embankment on the west edge of Vanport, Oregon gave way. The hole was 6 feet wide. Within minutes, it was 500. Behind it stood the Columbia River, swollen to the highest level ever recorded, 15 feet above the streets it was about to enter. Vanport was the second largest city in Oregon. 18,500 people lived there that afternoon. It had schools, a hospital, a movie theater, a college, 2 shopping centers, and more than 10,000 apartments. It had been Oregon's proudest wartime achievement, built in 110 days, home at its peak to 40,000 people. By nightfall, it was underwater. By the next morning, it did not exist. 15 people were dead, 18,000 were homeless, and the city was never rebuilt. Not damaged, not evacuated and restored, erased. Today, the ground where Vanport stood is a park, a racetrack, and a freeway interchange, and almost no one driving over it knows a city is buried underneath. Here is the detail that turns a natural disaster into something harder to forgive. That same morning, hours before the water came, the people of Vanport had been handed a printed notice by the agency responsible for their safety. It read, "Remember, dikes are safe at present. You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited." They had 35 minutes. Many had less. The warning never came. To understand how 18,000 people ended up trusting that piece of paper and why the people who wrote it were so willing to let them, you have to go back to the beginning, to a war, a shipbuilder, and a stretch of floodplain nobody was supposed to live on. In 1940, a man named Henry J. Kaiser signed a contract to build ships, first for the British, then for the United States, and eventually at a scale that had never been attempted in human history. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder by trade. He was a road and dam industrialist, a man who had helped build Hoover Dam, and he approached shipbuilding the way he approached concrete, as a problem of volume and speed. His shipyards along the Columbia River, in the Portland-Vancouver area, would go on to build more than 1,000 vessels during the war, some of them assembled in a matter of days. He chose the Portland area, in part because of the cheap hydroelectric power flowing from the newly completed Bonneville Dam. Cheap power, deep water, and a river with access to the Pacific. On paper, it was ideal. There was one problem, and it was enormous. To build ships that fast, Kaiser needed workers, tens of thousands of them. He recruited from across the entire country, pulling in men and women from every state, and they all arrived at once, and Portland had nowhere to put them. The city's housing was full. Workers slept in cars, in tents, in parks, on floors. The labor was there, but the beds were not. And without beds, the shipyards would stall. Portland itself was not eager to help. The city was conservative, insular, and openly hostile to the flood of newcomers, many of whom were poor, many of whom were black. Portland did not want to build housing for them, so Kaiser went around the city entirely. He secured federal funding and federal land, and he built his own city from scratch. The site was 650 acres of low ground on the Columbia floodplain, between Portland and Vancouver. The land was cheap for a reason. It sat below the level of the river, protected only by a system of dikes, in a bowl that the Columbia would fill the instant those dikes failed. Everyone involved knew this. It was flat, empty, available, and dangerous, and it was chosen anyway because the war would not wait for safer ground. Construction began in 1942. The city rose in 110 days. When Vanport opened in 1943, its first residents made it, on day 1, the second largest city in Oregon. They named it Vanport, a compression of Vancouver and Portland, because it sat between the two. It was built fast, and it was built cheap. The apartment blocks were long, plain, wood frame buildings, hundreds of them, set on wooden posts rather than proper foundations, because the whole place was meant to be temporary, torn down as soon as the war ended. The walls were thin. The ground was muddy nearly year-round, sitting as it did on a floodplain in the rainy Pacific Northwest. Sluices and drainage ditches cut through the city, a constant reminder that the land wanted to be a wetland and was only borrowing its dryness from the dikes. But it was a real city. At its wartime peak, more than 40,000 people lived in Vanport. It had its own fire department, its own police, its own hospital, its own schools and nurseries and community centers, 2 shopping centers, and a movie theater. Kaiser built one of the first around-the-clock industrial childcare centers in America so that mothers working the swing shift could drop their children off at any hour and go build warships. Women worked the yards in enormous numbers. The city ran on shifts, 3 of them, the machines and the mothers and the welders never fully stopping. And then there was the thing that made Vanport unlike anywhere else in Oregon. Kaiser needed workers so badly that he did not care what color they were, and he recruited black workers directly out of the Jim Crow South, out of Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas, and brought them to the Pacific Northwest. This mattered more in Oregon than it would have almost anywhere else in the country. Oregon had entered the Union with language in its constitution attempting to bar black people from living in the state at all. It was one of the most openly hostile states in the nation toward black residents. And into that state, Vanport brought up to 10,000 black workers and their families, more than 3 times the entire black population of Portland just a couple of years earlier. Vanport became the most integrated city Oregon had ever had. Its schools were integrated, its child care was integrated, its recreation facilities were integrated. For families who had come from the segregated South, where they could not vote, could not sit at a lunch counter, could not walk certain streets after dark, Vanport was not paradise, but it was something they had never had. Steady work at good wages, schools where their children sat beside white children, a functioning community. The discrimination did not vanish. Black families were quietly steered into the least desirable units, the ones nearest the low ground and the sloughs, the units most likely to flood. They were blamed unfairly for the city's crime and its rough reputation. But compared to what they had fled, Vanport was a life worth keeping, and when the war ended, many of them chose to stay. The war ended in 1945, and Vanport's reason for existing ended with it. The shipyards wound down, the contracts stopped. The workforce that had built 1,000 ships was no longer needed, and the temporary city that had housed it was, by its own original logic, supposed to disappear. Many residents left. The population fell from its wartime peak of 40,000 down toward 18,000. But it did not empty. Returning GIs and their families moved into the vacant units, and the state opened Vanport College, a 2-year school built to absorb the flood of veterans overwhelming Oregon's universities on the GI Bill. The college went up right near the dike, and the black residents largely stayed, not because Vanport was wonderful, but because they had nowhere else in Oregon they were permitted to go. This is the part that explains everything that followed. Portland was governed by redlining and de facto segregation. Black residents could realistically buy or rent in only one small district of the city, a neighborhood called Albina. And Albina was already full. The doors to the rest of Portland were closed. So thousands of black families remained in Vanport's aging, deteriorating temporary apartments on the floodplain behind the dikes, because it was the only place that would have them. By 1948, Portland's civic leadership had begun describing Vanport in public with a specific and telling vocabulary. They called it an eyesore, a slum, blighted, troublesome. The housing was falling apart, and the population was poor and racially mixed, and the city's leaders made no secret that they considered the whole place a problem they wished would go away. Roughly 1/3 of the 18,000 people still living there were black, which meant that a large share of Oregon's entire black population was now concentrated in one condemned-looking city sitting 15 feet below a major river. The winter of 1948 dropped an enormous snowpack across the mountains that fed the Columbia. Then spring arrived unusually warm, and it arrived fast, and all that snow began to melt at once. The Columbia started to rise, and it kept rising. By May 25th, both the Columbia and the Willamette were running 8 feet above flood stage. The people whose job it was to watch the dikes understood what was coming. The Housing Authority of Portland, which ran Vanport, began around-the-clock patrols of the dikes that day, 5 days before the flood. Fire crews walked the embankments in 4-hour shifts, looking for the warning signs of failure, seepage, soft spots, boils where water pushes up through the base, muddy water where there should be none. They found them. On the morning of the disaster, a fire captain named Robert English reported for a dike patrol that had already been running for 2 days. Problems on the railroad fill had first been observed roughly 7 hours before it finally broke. The signs were there, and they grew worse as the day went on, and they were reported up the chain. While the patrols walked the dikes, the housing authority made a series of quiet decisions that would look very different by the end of the day. It moved its own files and equipment out of its Vanport offices to safe ground, and at the racetrack next door, roughly 600 horses were evacuated to higher ground, out of the path of the rising water. The horses were removed. The 18,000 people were not. The Army Corps of Engineers had assured the housing authority that the dikes would hold, and evacuating a mostly poor, heavily black population into a city that had already made clear it did not want them was a political problem no one wanted to own. And so on the morning of Sunday, May 30th, 1948, instead of an evacuation order, the residents of Vanport received a flyer. It told them the dikes were safe. It told them they would be warned if there was danger. It told them they would have time to leave. It told them not to get excited. Every promise on that piece of paper would be broken within hours. The weakest point in the entire system was the one nobody feared. Along the northwest edge of the city, separating Vanport from Smith Lake, ran a railroad embankment. It was not a purpose-built dike. It was a fill for the railroad tracks that happened to double as part of the flood barrier. Responsibility for it was murky, split between the railroad and the housing authority and the Corps, and because no one clearly owned it, everyone had quietly assumed it was solid. The segment of the barrier that people trusted most was the one segment that had never been engineered to hold back a river at all. It was a warm holiday Sunday afternoon. People were out, children were fishing in the Columbia Slough, families were visiting, the theater was running. At 4:17 p.m., the railroad fill failed. The break began as a hole about 6 feet across. The Columbia, standing 15 feet above the city, poured through it, and the pressure of that water tore the hole open until it was 500 feet wide. A wall of river came through the gap into the bowl where the city sat. The apartment buildings had no real foundations. They sat on wooden posts. When the water reached them, they did not break apart where they stood. They lifted. Entire buildings floated off their footings, turned, collided, and came apart. Cars washed away. Everything anyone owned went with the water. Within 10 minutes, the city was inundated. Within roughly 35 minutes, the residential core was gone. The promised warning system, the one the flyer had guaranteed, effectively failed. The people who actually saved lives that afternoon were not officials. They were students and faculty from Vanport College who had come in on their day off to collect research projects from their offices, saw the water coming, and ran through the streets on foot, pounding on doors and walls, screaming at people to get out. Neighbors warned neighbors. Strangers pulled strangers out of the rising water. Some residents had 35 minutes, some had 10. Some, in the parts of the city furthest from the break, had almost no warning at all beyond the sound of the water itself, a low roar arriving ahead of the flood. People climbed onto rooftops and were left stranded there as the city disappeared beneath them. A pilot circling overhead watched the entire second-largest city in Oregon vanish and had no way to tell anyone below to run. By nightfall, Vanport was a lake with roofs sticking out of it. The official death toll was 15, with 7 more reported missing. For a disaster of this scale, an entire city drowned in under an hour. That number is remarkably low, and it is low for one reason. The college students and the neighbors got almost everyone out in that narrow window. Most people lived. That fact is real, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Almost no one who survived believed the number. In the days after the flood, rumors spread that the true toll was in the hundreds, that the authorities were covering it up, that bodies were being secretly disposed of, shipped away or hidden in a downtown ice plant to keep the count down. Most historians consider these specific rumors false. There were probably not hundreds of hidden dead. But the rumors reveal something more important than a body count. they reveal that trust had been destroyed as completely as the city. The same authority that had printed "you will have time to leave" was now the authority reporting that exactly 15 people had died. The residents had been told the dikes were safe, and they had watched their homes float away, and so they would not believe the official numbers, and no one could reasonably expect them to. When an institution's last words to you are proven fatal within hours, its arithmetic afterward carries no weight. President Harry Truman came to Oregon and walked the ruins on foot. The New York Times called Vanport the town that is no more. Truman signed a $10 million relief bill for flood victims across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. For a brief window, something unusual happened. White Portland families opened their homes to black families made homeless by the water, and the color line in the city softened. It did not last. The flood destroyed Vanport so thoroughly that rebuilding was never seriously considered. The city was declared beyond repair. The land became Delta Park, a horse racing track, and eventually part of a freeway interchange. There is no lake, no ruin, no marker on the ground. The most integrated city Oregon ever built left behind less physical trace than almost any drowned town in America, because it was not preserved underwater, but simply scraped away and paved over. The 18,000 people, however, did not disappear. They had to go somewhere, and where they went reshaped Portland for the next half-century. The white residents were absorbed more or less into the rest of the city. The roughly 6,000 black residents had almost nowhere legal to go. Redlining still confined them to Albina, and the number of displaced black families was roughly equal to the entire existing population of that district. A second Albina could not be fit inside the first one. The math was impossible, and the city did little to change it. Some families ended up back in other temporary housing. Some doubled and tripled up in Albina's overcrowded blocks. Some spent years finding permanent homes. Decades later, Portland's own housing authority admitted in a formal recorded apology that after the flood it had not helped black residents relocate throughout the city, that it had reinforced their segregation, and that what the city's leadership had really wanted was for black people to leave. They did not leave. They were funneled into Albina and kept there. A scholar named Karen Gibson later put it bluntly: the flood that washed away Vanport did not solve the housing problem. It swept in the final phase of ghetto building in central Portland. The disaster that made 18,000 people homeless in an afternoon became the mechanism that concentrated black Portland into one overcrowded, underserved district and held it there. By 1960, 12 years after the flood, nearly 4 out of every 5 black Portlanders still lived in Albina. Portland schools ended up about as segregated as Alabama's. Oregon did not pass a civil rights bill banning discrimination in public places until 1953, 5 years after the flood. The real estate industry dragged its feet on removing openly racist practices from its own code of conduct for years after that. The river had done what the flyer, the dikes, and the civic leaders who called Vanport a blight had all been circling but could not quite accomplish on their own. It cleared the floodplain. It ended the most integrated city Oregon had ever produced, and it delivered the survivors into exactly the confinement the state had always seemed to want for them. Vanport lasted 6 years. It was built in 110 days to win a war, thrown up on cheap floodplain land that everyone knew would flood the moment the dikes failed, and it was called temporary from the first day to the last. That word, temporary, is where the whole story turns. A place called temporary does not get permanent foundations. It does not get a dike that someone is clearly responsible for maintaining. It does not get an evacuation when the river rises, because evacuating it is expensive and inconvenient, and the place was never meant to last anyway. And the people who live in a place called temporary are, over time, treated as temporary themselves, right up until the water proves it. On the morning of the flood, someone with authority looked at the rising Columbia and decided the 600 horses at the racetrack were worth moving to high ground. The same authority looked at 18,000 people and decided the appropriate action was a flyer that said, "Don't get excited." There is no document ordering anyone to drown. There did not need to be. Indifference and malice produce the same body count, and indifference has the advantage of never requiring anyone to make a decision they can later be blamed for. The buildings floated off their wooden posts because they had been built to be disposable. The city's response to the flood revealed that its residents had been regarded all along in much the same way. It took the city's own housing authority 70 years to stand up and say, on the record, that they had handled it wrong, that they had wanted those people gone. Vanport was the second largest city in Oregon and the largest public housing project in the United States. It was the proof that Oregon could be something better than its own founding documents, an integrated city that worked, that educated black and white children in the same classrooms while much of the country would not. It stood for 6 years. It drowned in 35 minutes. And then it was paved over so completely that people now drive across its grave every day without knowing it is there. If this kind of story stays with you, the American communities the water took and the decisions that put them in the water's path, there are more of them waiting. Kennett, California, a copper town that poisoned itself and then vanished under Shasta Lake without a single public hearing. The Quabbin Reservoir in Massachusetts, where 4 whole towns were legally voted out of existence so Boston could drink. And Oscarville, Georgia, the black community driven out by racial terror in 1912 and then drowned under Lake Lanier decades later. Tell us which one to walk into next before the water comes.